This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international programme of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by Lee Hutchison. Hi Lee, how are you?
Yeah, a pleasure to be here. I think the last time I was on your podcast wasn't as a guest, but it was an answer to a quiz question, and it was a quiz question I got right. So it feels like a privilege and an honour to be on this podcast.
Oh, well, that's good. Was that was that the question about which was the episode that gone on the longest?
Correct. Yeah, I was sitting there just like having a lovely walk. I think it might have been like one of my kind of Christmas Day listens or something like that, going for a walk, and I was sitting there just screaming at Tony and Clara. It's like, it's me, it's that episode. And I gave myself a point at home for it. Very good.
It's a dubious honour being, partially responsible for one of the longest episodes, but definitely some of those episode names ones did come out a bit on the long side. Hopefully this one won't be going for any records along those lines, but who knows? Because the topic we're looking at today is a kind of curious little one, really. We're looking at the 1977 Dario Argento film Suspiria and what links, if any, it has to the Voyager episode Cold Fire, in which the female caretaker, although she doesn't like to be thought of as a caretaker, is given the name Suspiria. And this is an episode obviously written by Brannon Braga, who we know has a big passion for kind of classic horror movies. It should be said, when I had him on the podcast and asked him about it, he couldn't even remember writing this episode, so he wasn't much help. But I noticed a little while later that you had put a thing up on Twitter sort of comparing individual shots from the episode and the movie, and sort of trying to draw more parallels between them, I suppose. So I just thought it'd be interesting to kind of dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, it was one of those ones. I think it was one of those like mid-November kind of lockdown feelings. I think TrekCore did their amazing Trek on this day, and I've recently just kind of come off a Star Trek Voyager rewatch. I started rewatching it again along with the Delta Flyers podcast, and then with the way kind of lockdown and COVID has gone, I've ended up just sort of finishing Voyager. So the episode was quite fresh in my mind at the time, and an episode I really quite like for sort of how kind of much it stands out compared to a lot of different Voyager episodes. And while the only thing on paper that connects that to the Suspiria film is there is a creature called Suspiria, I think there's a lot more kind of going on that can be drawn between the films, and probably not just in a visual context, which will probably be a relief for people that are listening on a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird one, isn't it? I quite like that episode. I do think it's a very strange episode, and I am kind of curious. I'd love to know more about how that episode came to be, because it has a teleplay credit to Brannon Braga, but a story credit to someone else. And I'm kind of curious how much of, often when you have someone sells a story to Star Trek, it may only be one element of it that actually ends up sort of informing the finished episode. It's not necessarily that they've worked out kind of all the beats and the whole kind of structure of it and everything that's going to happen. So I'm kind of curious, because it seems like such a weird choice, given, we met the original caretaker, obviously, in the pilot, and there was this mention there that there was another one, that there was a female one, another entity that would be capable of flinging Voyager back to the Alpha Quadrant, which apparently was put in at the request of Paramount executives who were anxious that this whole kind of Lost in Space kind of setup for the new show might not work, and that they wanted a kind of easy out if they wanted to switch to doing Voyager as a kind of, continuation of Next Gen, basically back in the kind of familiar landscape of Star Trek. So they wanted to have this kind of backdoor sort of inserted in there in the pilot episode to say, look, that we know there's an easy way back if we can only find it. Then they don't mention it for like a season and a half or something. And then they come back with this episode, and they come back to it in such a weird way. I've always thought it's, you would never imagine that the sequel to Caretaker was going to be this kind of weird, creepy horror story.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was the same as you. You always notice, especially with a lot of kind of, before they sort of decided that they had to get away legally from this sort of like open kind of pitching that kind of Star Trek was really famous for, especially under Michael Piller, who was still kind of prevalent in Voyager at the time. So I was like, Anthony Williams, I don't really recognize that name. So I kind of turned to trusty Memory Alpha, and apparently he was an assistant advertising manager at Paramount at the time, and his only ever other sort of credit on Voyager was for Innocence. So potentially another sort of horror, episode in a potential way. Sort of, it's a very sort of slight, easy episode to watch, but it has the concept of people aging backwards, that these young children that are about to die are actually, elders in a way. So yeah, it was interesting. So I kind of was thinking like the same as you. What did he bring to this episode? Like, I kind of took for granted that they've always got to have it baked in that there's going to be this female caretaker where will come along again at some point. I wonder if the idea that he maybe brought was sort of playing with Kess's telepathic powers, the kind of Ocampans on a spaceship. I thought it was maybe just something as simple as that, or maybe sort of her and Tuvok kind of working on these powers together, and then sort of Brannon Braga coming in, and then what we kind of know about him, especially from your interview with him about sort of his horror background, bringing in a lot of the horror elements and, really kind of going to town with this kind of original idea and going, right, it's time to bring back the female caretaker, let's see what we can kind of do.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, I mean, I think there was some reference on Memory Alpha to it being referred to as the Kess Firebug episode, which suggests that kind of scene where she incinerates all those plants and so on was a kind of key idea right from the get-go. It does seem weird. I guess one of the things that seems weird to me is that that by this point in the show, they didn't have a plan for what they were going to do with this female caretaker, that it took an outside pitch for someone to sort of bring them an opportunity to tell that story. It kind of seems, because it's such an obvious thread that's been dangling ever since the pilot episode and is waiting to be picked up. And at the end of this episode, even there's kind of, Janeway says, I'm going to try and talk her around, let's hope we can persuade her to help us in the end. But then, of course, we never see her again. So it's this weird, it just strikes me as odd that having put that backdoor in there right at the beginning, it seems as if they hadn't been thinking, what should we do to kind of pay this off? And it was, it took someone else coming in with a story idea for them to say, okay, right, this is how we're going to kind of handle this one. And again, not even really decide one way or the other. Are we closing that door now, or are we kind of leaving it open, just in case we decide we need to use it in the future?
As I kind of touched on, I've recently just sort of finished watching Voyager. I find season 2 in particular like a real kind of standout season for some kind of the interesting ideas that they kind of go down. I don't think all of them are successful, but I think season 1 and 2 are more darker kind of Voyager episodes than sort of what we were to come. I think from sort of season 3 onwards feels very family, very quite safe. Not to say that doesn't really apply to season 2, etc., but there feels more of an edge to it. And when I kind of watched all these like 176 odd episodes of kind of Voyager back to back to back for probably the first time since it kind of aired, was, it's all, I think I've heard it on kind of podcasts where people have talked about it, where it's like, Voyager's the show I watch to drift off. And they don't mean that in an offensive way. They just mean it's safe, enjoyable, and relaxing. And Voyager rarely surprises, but I find this episode is filled with a lot of odd choices and a lot of odd decisions that I think we'll certainly touch on. But the one thing that surprised me, and I completely forgot about it being a thing, was that the episode opens with a previously on, which is the first one they do in Voyager, but it's in a very different way. It's not the usual Major Barrett where it's like previously on Star Trek Voyager, now the conclusion. It very much opens with a narration where it's like, her going 10 months ago, the crew of Voyager was pulled into the Delta Quadrant by an entity known as the Caretaker. When he died, Voyager's best chance of getting home died with him, but he revealed one hopeful possibility. A little flashes of some images to Caretaker. And I remember sort of Ronald D. Moore talking about Voyager when he came on and he left. He was like, why not do previously ons? Just catch the audience up to date. It immediately sort of drew the parallel when I rewatched Suspiria. That is also a film that opens with a single voiceover where it's like Susie Bannion decided to perfect her ballet studies in the most famous school of dance in Europe. She chose the celebrated academy in Freiburg. One day at 9 a.m, she left Kennedy Airport, New York, and arrived in Germany at 10:40 p.m. local time. So very much like a simple kind of narration that it could easily be explained sort of in dialogue, but both of them choose to give very simple information in their narration about how we got to the point we're at just now. And maybe it's incredibly tenuous, and that might, signpost quite a few of my points. 10:40 is when she arrives in Germany, and it's 10 months on from when Voyager kind of arrives in the Delta Quadrant. So it felt very odd to have that different Major Barrett kind of narration.
And she's actually credited at the end of the episode as narrator, not as, computer voice or whatever, which is interesting. Yeah, that did strike me that there's that weird parallel there. And I can't help wondering, was that deliberate? Was it kind of unconsciously deliberate? Because there's a weird aspect as well. In both cases, the narration kind of goes nowhere. It's there at the beginning, but it gets dropped. And there's no, in the movie, there isn't even a kind of bookend at the end or anything. And obviously in the Voyager episode, it is, I think, unique. I think it's the only time. I mean, obviously, normally we're kind of used to Major Barrett doing the last time on Star Trek Voyager. And on one level, it performs a similar function to that insofar as she's not the computer voice. She's not, it's not within the universe of the show. It's acknowledging that this is a TV show and she's, providing that link. But something about it's odd. It's very odd that it's this kind of unique thing. Normally we get a captain's log. If we get a narration, it's someone who's actually in the story. And in both cases, it's this quite oddly specific, detached third person narration that you get, not from one of the characters, but from this kind of more sort of authorial voice almost. And I think when you have that level of detail in the narration at the beginning of Suspiria, it is quite weird to mention what time she arrived. It is kind of saying, this is a story that I'm telling you, whoever I might be. But you're never going to find out any more about me or, why you even, frankly needed that information. I don't think that the remake of Suspiria, which I've only watched the first 20 minutes of, I have to say, on your recommendation, I noticed does away with the narrator. It doesn't seem to require that kind of scene setting. And I think it is kind of an odd choice in both instances. And I think that is definitely a parallel that you can't help noticing if you're watching these two things together.
Yeah, it's interesting. And kind of like, when I sort of looked at sort of like and obviously we'll go into kind of more detail, is sort of like, I thought, right, okay, Susie Bannion, the lead character in Suspiria, and Kes are our main kind of characters here. And, this is very much their episode and their movie. And they're both sort of very vulnerable and coming to kind of an alien world, coming from sort of like, America, sort of the bastion of sort of Western civilization to sort of, Freiburg, sort of like, very much kind of communist sort of Germany of the 70s, both, obviously, it must be said, amazing scream queens in this episode, but you sort of see it that the coven takes sort of this really special interest in Susie when she arrives at the academy, because she believes that, they believe that, Susie can kind of serve them and therefore sort of master Suspirium. And the plot obviously culminates in sort of a bloody climax, and illuminates sort of that the coven has been trying to achieve this all along with Susie and the power that she has. Very similar to sort of Kes, sort of Tanis is very much this kind of person that takes a very special interest in Kes. And we sort of see that well, it's going to be a bit of more of a longer journey for Kes, that she's someone that sort of develops these powers. We sort of see the damage that she can do to Tuvok and Tanis in this episode, but in sort of future episodes like The Gift, we see the positive side, and then in Fury, for example, the sort of darker side of these powers. And we can probably see why both sort of Susie and Kes are interesting kind of characters, and ones that very much are being kind of groomed by sort of the kind of protagonist in this episode, the antagonist in the episode.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a kind of parallel. They're both very young. I mean, Kes literally is supposed to be 2 years old, right? But they're both, they seem very young. They seem very innocent, kind of naive. Susie Bannion seems like this quite sort of virginal character somehow in this slightly depraved, crazy world. The other film that a lot of people, I suppose, maybe link with Suspiria is Black Swan. And I think that was the first time I actually heard people talking about the movie Suspiria, which I only watched, just this week for the benefit of this podcast. I have to say it's not, I'd say it's a kind of cult classic, if you know what I mean, rather than necessarily a super popular film. In terms of Kes, I've always sort of thought the more obvious parallel in some ways is Carrie, because you've got the kind of telekinesis, and you've got, again, some of the kind of visual language sort of maybe to me maybe evokes Carrie more than this movie. But I think obviously the fact that they choose to call the female caretaker Suspiria makes us kind of focus in on that as an influence. And there certainly are parallels. I have to say, I mean, I'm looking forward to finishing watching the remake, because my understanding is, and I may be wrong about this, but I get the sense that the remake maybe makes slightly more sense. There's something about the 1977 film. It is amazing. I mean, it's a remarkable piece of work. It's very striking. It's extremely freaky. It's quite beautiful the way it's shot. It has terrifying. It almost doesn't do it justice to call it a score. The kind of musical sound of it is quite overwhelming. But it is very sort of not quite impressionistic, but it has sort of it's more kind of art housey than sort of mainstream, easy to follow filmmaking, if you know what I mean. I certainly felt anyway, having watched it, that I was still slightly baffled a lot of the time as to what was going on. And by the end, I sort of at least got the gist of it, but I'm not sure that I totally understood everything I'd seen. Actually, in a weird way, there is a kind of parallel with Coldfire that I'm not quite clear what was really going. What did Suspiria want? Because it's slightly unclear. They seem to want Kes, but then earlier on, there's this scene where Suspiria says to the kind of slightly creepy Ocampan guy, "I don't care about the girl, just get me the ship." Now, what does she want Voyager for? She doesn't seem like she needs a ship. So it's all of that side of it is never really explained. They sort of, we get that she's kind of evil, and we get that very early on, because by calling her that, I mean, even if you didn't know anything about the movie, it's such a sinister sounding name, which I think is one of the main reasons why the movie takes that as its name. That, when the guy's like, "Oh yeah, we've got a caretaker too, she's called Suspiria," you sort of immediately think, oh, okay, this is maybe not the kind of cozy sequel to Caretaker that we might have been expecting. Something kind of a bit nasty and unpleasant's going to happen here.
Yeah, I find it interesting as well when you think of you think of there's a character called Suspiria. We're going to meet the caretaker's female mate, but the real focus seems to be on sort of Tanis. He seems to be sort of the real, antagonist. He almost is acting in, when I was kind of watching it back again today, sort of his language that he uses, that he is very much grooming Kes. He's highlighting sort of her surroundings, how sterile, lifeless, very much divide and conquer of like, oh, there's nothing here that can be stimulating whatsoever. And she's like, well, there's like 170 people here. And it's like, oh, they mean nothing and so on. And he's very much trying to separate Kes from her ship's mates, and even sort of like that temptation with all the powers that could come and so on. Like when he goes like to Kes, Suspiria taught us to develop our psychokinetic skills that had lain dormant for so long. We have abilities far beyond anything you can imagine. And it reminded me of something that Miss Tanner says in Suspiria, where it's like, I had no idea you were so strong-willed. I can see that once you make up your mind about something, nothing will change it for you. My compliments. So it's that almost idea that sort of Kes is someone, and Tuvok obviously follows that up with like, do not underestimate your own potential, Kes. Your mental abilities are rapidly maturing. And, Tanis supports that. Like, yeah, I might be able to help you, no offense to Mr. Tuvok, but I'm more familiar with the occult mind. So he's very much sort of like, there's that parallel where sort of Susie and Kes are sort of, as you sort of virginal, sort of untapped, so much potential can be activated. Very similar to Carrie. And you could sort of get the impression that sort of Tanis is potentially acting on behalf of, he's the sort of very similar to the Dominion. He's the Vorta here, the friendly face that goes out there to sort of groom Kes, because we certainly see it in future episodes how powerful she can become, and probably even goes beyond someone like Tanis and many of the other Ocampans.
It's interesting that he's called Tanis, and the woman you mentioned in Suspiria is called Miss Tanner or Mrs. Tanner. I hadn't picked up on that. He's quite a sort of unpleasant character, isn't he? And yet she has to be sort of taken in by him, if you know what I mean. I mean, I think to the audience, it is clear quite quickly that he's a bit shifty in a way. There's that great scene early on as well, because he has this sort of almost contempt for sort of ordinary non-telekinetic mortals, where Neelix is sort of watching their lesson and he tries to kind of ask a question. He just sort of puts his hand up as if to say, shut up, get out of here, I'm not interested in you. He has this definitely this kind of real attitude. I mean, so in the movie Suspiria, I feel like, am I missing something? I sort of didn't get the sense that the main character was... Is she needed in this plot in some way? Or my sense was just that she was kind of asking too many questions and they wanted to get rid of her, sort of thing. Is that...
I think it's more perhaps in sort of the sequel that feels like it's kind of clearer. That I think it's one of those ones that I think, for my kind of interpretation of it, sort of potentially sort of a connection where I think it's more Suspiria than Coldfire, but it kind of got me thinking about sort of the kind of the feminist angles potentially in sort of Coldfire and kind of Voyager overall, where I kind of thought about... I find it's one of the creative decisions I find odd about this episode is that there are 2,000 odd Ocampan on the station, and we only sort of meet kind of one in Tanis. Yeah. And it's one of those ones I sort of thought of it as potentially sort of like a covenant of witches, potentially, because that's what the school is, and that's potentially what this space station is. Where you kind of think about it, where Tanis talks about that they have prolonged their lifespan to almost triple their kind of natural ability. Sort of thinking about that as potentially sort of a witchcraft kind of element. And it's sort of, when you think about kind of witchcraft, it's got such a history within sort of misogyny, kind of men fearing women, sort of accusing women of being witches and burning them, but also kind of witches as sort of feminist icons. They're also victims and the victor. And I kind of was thinking about sort of that, of like, are these Ocampan on the space station, is this essentially a covenant, much kind of like Suspiria, where they want to get Kes in part of their community and, further advance their kind of powers for who knows what end, but to get them in there, are they essentially portraying them as witches in a way? I think that's a deep cut that I think it's only coming perhaps from my mind, but I think there could be something there.
No, I think it's definitely, it struck me that it's a shame. I mean, I guess it's kind of a, bottle show choice in a way, isn't it? We don't even go onto the station. We don't get to see anything of that world. It's kind of tantalizingly close. And yeah, it does sort of seem like they have some kind of community that may be quite a sort of sinister community. It's interesting from the point of view of what you say about, witchcraft and the gender politics of that the intermediary, as you say, almost like the kind of Vorta is for the Dominion, the intermediary here is a man. I mean, they could have had it as a woman, and sort of really played into that. But I suppose the idea is that Suspiria is the kind of witchy character in a sense, just as in the movie Suspiria, I think she's referred to as the Black Queen, isn't she? She's this 19th century witch that has kind of been kept alive by all of them and is the kind of force behind everything. And we only get to see, you only really get sort of glimpse at the very end. But again, that sense, I suppose, you mentioned Tanis saying that they've managed to extend their lifespan. Well, obviously, that's also what she's managed to do. She's managed to kind of keep on going through, evil, nefarious, witchy means. It's an interesting choice, I suppose, even if it is just motivated by saving money, not to show us any of what's going on that station, because I agree, I think that would be fascinating. That would kind of give us a bit more of a sense of the context here and of sort of what's going on. I mean, the movie Suspiria, so much of it is about this kind of strange, freaky environment of this ballet school, and the kind of, even just on a sort of visual level, this school is this bright red building. I mean, the colour in the film is sort of spectacular. It's almost like, the only director I can think of who does something similar is like Almodovar, someone like, these films that are kind of saturated with these bright, vivid colours. And obviously, in a horror movie, you get a lot of, bright red blood everywhere and all this sort of thing. But it is very, it's quite mesmerising the way it's shot. And so much of it is sort of about that place, and the place itself being kind of creepy and sinister, quite apart from anything that's going on there. There's this big, long red corridor that we keep seeing, and there's the sort of design of it. It's almost another film that it reminded me of a little bit is The Shining, this sort of sense. I mean, different kind of palette, but a similar sense of this kind of really freaky environment that this girl is kind of stuck in somehow, and the kind of mysteries of it and not knowing quite what's going on there.
I think it was one of those, I think there's definitely an element similar to sort of Suspiria, where I get the impression sort of that potentially the sort of female caretaker takes potentially energy from these Ocampans, where I think there was like a line where Tanis was like, back to the Ocampan station, everyone's waiting for you, Kess. The connection has been made. You're part of us now. Your future has already begun. And I wonder how much that she kind of draws from sort of their telepathic kind of powers. And I think there would have been a really interesting sort of creative decision to be made here. Naturally, 2,000 people involves a hell of a lot of extras on the Paramount lot. But it's one of those things I would love to have seen sort of that connection between sort of Tanis, Kess, the female caretaker, and sort of the rest of this. I'm just going to call them now a covenant of sort of Ocampans. And, I think that there's something to be said sort of when we sort of are introduced to sort of the Ocampans back in sort of Caretaker. They are sort of an oppressed group. They sort of live underground. They've been banished. They live on a very barren world, but have had to make kind of life, make do underneath. Very kind of similar when you think about sort of like, kind of pagan beliefs, etc. They tend to get kind of attracted to sort of marginalized kind of groups, and especially kind of women. And sort of witchcraft tends to provide sort of an independence and power to women that's often denied to them in sort of an oppressive male-dominated structure. So you think of something like the Kazon and sort of how they kind of kept the Ocampans in kind of line and sort of had helped them and essentially drove them kind of underground. So, by sort of being on the surface, and how the caretaker, for example, he is someone that is essentially racked with guilt. He has there's been an ecological disaster on this planet, and he is forever trying to make it up to them by sort of like sending off this energy to the planet through the kind of pulses and so on, which were kind of starting to fall apart by the end. So very much you can kind of get the impression maybe once again sort of the Ocampans as witches, driven underground, sort of oppressed, and the patriarchy in this way is sort of a very apologetic and male caretaker, especially in the pilot.
It's interesting. I mean, in the movie Suspiria, there are hardly any male characters. There's one guy who's a sort of vague love interest, who's pretty kind of backgrounded. There's a guy who plays the piano, blind character, who dies in a kind of freaky, horrific way. But other than that, there's not, and there's a couple of experts who Susie goes to consult, who kind of explain to her and the audience, or at least give her some idea of what's going on, talking about this coven of witches and this idea that this ballet school was set up by someone who was thought to be a witch, long ago in the past and so on. But it is a very female environment. It is a sort of almost a kind of matriarchy, I suppose, within that ballet school. All the teachers are women, all the students are young women. And that is definitely a kind of interesting element of that environment, I suppose. And then at the end, there is a little boy, actually, you do see, and even at the very end where you kind of see the witches kind of meeting and deciding what to do, there's this kind of little blonde boy who seems to be hanging around with them, who's obviously part of their... He's allowed to be there for whatever reason. He obviously knows something of what's going on. I mean, it's kind of weird film. There are just a lot of these sort of slightly freakish characters, and you don't even quite know, do they have anything to do with the... It's almost just sort of sinister set dressing, if you know what I mean. Like, there's these kind of slightly scary fat Russian women in the kitchen who keep chopping things very intensely with their knives, and there's this kind of sense of this world that is just sort of horrifying in every conceivable way, somehow, this sort of environment.
To pull on something you kind of said there, and it was something I thought of at the time, so obviously I'm not going to spoil kind of the Suspiria remake, but I think sort of the original, the remake, and sort of Coalfire all sort of share sort of a connective tissue in terms of sort of the creative process, where I think they go even further really in the Suspiria remake, where there is a main male character that is also played by Tilda Swinton. There is no sort of magical thing behind it. They have just gone, we'll just get Tilda Swinton to play an old man in addition to sort of Mother Suspiria as well. Okay, fair enough. The only male characters that are played by males in it are two police officers that are laughed at for their genitals. Very similar trait, in terms of witches. That is something where it's about taking away from a male's manhood and so on. There's points about that. But ultimately, behind the scenes, this is a feminist movie that is written by two men, with a director as well, that is male, and it's predominantly male behind the scenes, similar to the original Suspiria. Again, the same applies to sort of Coalfire. Again, this is Brannon Braga, directed by Cliff Bole, his first time directing on Voyager, one of Trek's most prolific directors, again, male. And for something like Voyager, for example, it's held up as the first real feminist Star Trek kind of show. A female captain, predominantly female characters, Taurus and Kes. The first Star Trek series co-created by a woman in terms of Jerry Taylor. But ultimately, we see most of these kind of characters. Janeway is very much written predominantly by a man, unless sort of Jerry Taylor, Lisa Klink, for example, and a couple of others, unless they're involved, predominantly directed by men and so on. So there's always one of these things, like it's often that things that get held up as feminist icons and feminist pieces of work about women and feminist stories, they often all come from a male gaze. And I think of a line that was in the Suspiria remake where it's like, when you dance a dance, you do it in the image of its creator. Ultimately, Kes, Janeway, female caretaker, all these feminist heroes, Taurus, Seven of Nine, they pretty much come from the pen of Brannon Braga, and for example, and many of the other sort of prolific Voyager writers, which were largely male writing rooms.
Well, there is a kind of interesting tendency there, I suppose, in a way, that you do have. I mean, the horror genre as a whole, and the many subgenres within it is a kind of complicated one, because in some ways it often presents young women as victims of generally male violence. I suppose in this film it's not, it's kind of ultimately all orchestrated by these female antagonists. But usually in, sort of slasher movie or something, there's kind of a man committing acts of violence against women. But then you always have this, the final girl. You have the kind of, the protagonist is a woman who kind of survives it. She is the scream queen. She's the kind of one who makes it through. And that's absolutely what you have in Suspiria. I mean, her friend dies in a bizarre, horrific way. A previous student, I think one of the most shocking kind of set pieces in the movie is at the very beginning when she first arrives, and this girl who's been kind of trying to leave is murdered in this kind of weird, kind of semi-supernatural, totally horrific way, and ends up kind of crashing through a skylight and being hanged, with blood dripping from the ceiling in this rather grand building. I mean, it's a very striking set piece. And again, the kind of music comes in and is just bombarding you with this kind of cacophony almost of scary noises and so on. So there's a kind of weird contradiction there somehow in a lot of kind of horror storytelling. It's interesting to me, though, that we have, I mean, you mentioned Brannon Braga writing this. Brannon Braga, obviously, a few years later would give us the Borg Queen, this very kind of sexy female villain. Something that I don't think Star Trek had really leaned into before. It's interesting, I think, you know, we had the caretaker as this crusty old man. It would have been very easy to make Suspiria a sort of vampish, kind of sexualized antagonist. And they don't at all. Instead, they present her as this kind of little girl, which is creepy in its own way. I mean, that kind of taps into another whole element of horror. Paedophobia, I think, is, you know, the kind of fear of little children. And Brannon, when I was talking to him, mentioned one of his favourite horror films is an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw, which is absolutely, you know, leans into that idea of the kind of freakiness of little children. And maybe that's another reason why you have this kind of young boy in the original Suspiria, that there's something, he looks quite innocent, but obviously he can't be because of what he's involved in somehow. But I do think it's interesting that the choice there was not made to produce a sort of strong, tough, possibly sexualized kind of, you know, we don't really get a sort of anti-Janeway to go up against Janeway. We don't get a kind of, we don't get the Intendant from DS9. Do you know what I mean? We could, if Suspiria wants to manifest in a corporeal, sort of human way, in some ways, the more, you wouldn't be surprised if they went in that direction, but instead they don't. She goes down the route of being this sort of, little blonde girl who sometimes speaks with a slightly freakishly old voice.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Like when I think back of, like, before I'd rewatched this episode, maybe sort of last year, where I thought, you know, what was sort of the Suspiria character like in this episode? And I remember the young kid, but essentially she has sort of 3 different forms in it. Like you touch on it, she has that older hoarse voice, very much like that kind of Mother Suspiria that we hear in the film. And then we sort of see her sort of in this young child form, and then this sort of like purple space, you know, snake kind of approach, which was interesting. And, you know, I felt like it was one of the sort of more connections I thought was very much on the, you know, between sort of the episode and the film, was sort of how sort of the female caretaker seemed to cross over with sort of Madame Blanc, really, you know, Mother Suspiria, where sort of like they're both plotting the downfall of sort of our main characters in terms of Kes and the ship. And it's Kes and Susie that discover this, you know. Kes kind of as like Susie sort of like through the whole thing, she takes action, she discovers, and like she, you know, highlights it, you know, Kes is like, I can feel her presence, she's powerful, turbulent, she's upset, she's angry. And Tanis tries to stop her and she's like, she wants to destroy the ship. And Marcos, very much like the female caretaker, can change form, and we sort of see her in that climax sort of become the silhouette character. So yeah, it was really interesting to sort of see that connections, you know, sort of like Marcos in sort of like is in her true monster form, like the caretaker in her true form is like this snake-like creature. She's not human, and she's not as human as she presents, but she's also not part of the world as we know it sort of either. She lives in subspace and she has to be brought out, but she has power, she controls things, and the people sort of around her, sort of very similar to sort of the male kind of caretaker. So kind of Marcos, much like Suspiria, is very much a supernatural being. I get the sort of the impression from that, and it feels very much sort of the two are very much kind of alike there. Yeah,
definitely. I think you can see that. I mean, we don't. I don't know about the remake, but certainly in the original, we don't really get to see her pretty much at all. To be honest, she's this kind of invisible figure, and I suppose the same is true of Suspiria in the Star Trek episode. We don't get to see her until, you know, the final, probably like 10 minutes or something. She kind of makes an appearance, and she makes an appearance in this very obviously fake guise of the little girl. You know, we sort of know that's not her true form in a sense. In the movie, the first time we see her that I can think of is that she's this figure that seems to be sort of snoring or sighing. It's something weird. And the word Suspiria as well. I mean, just to talk about, you know, why we're talking about why this episode is named Suspiria, obviously in reference to the film, but why the film is named Suspiria is also a kind of slightly complicated question. It's thought that to some extent it's thought that in part it's inspired by Thomas de Quincey's Suspiria de Profundis, which is a kind of, from my understanding, I haven't read it, a sort of slightly trippy, creepy, weird work. But it also, the word Suspiria in Latin can mean something along the lines of sighs or whispers. I guess the idea of whispers is quite kind of evocative. Sighs, though, I think also ties in with this idea of this kind of mysterious figure that's not really seen, that is making this kind of quite sinister, it's not exactly snoring, it is a kind of laboured breathing, I suppose. And I did notice in the remake, of which, as I said, I've only watched the first few minutes, it actually starts with another character, the protagonist's mother, dying in a kind of, with that kind of laboured breathing that we maybe associate with that. And I suppose partly that works because we associate it with death and mortality, and so on. And here's this character who should have been dead, long since, but has kind of eked out her life through kind of sinister, magical means. We don't really get any sense of that with Tanis in the Voyager episode. I mean, the fact that he's 14 years old and the Okumpa are supposed to die when they're 9 or whatever, he seems sort of healthy and kind of ordinary in a sense. There's no sense that he's kind of that there's any sort of trade-off to that, which in a way might have been quite interesting, because certainly Marcos in the movie has become a sort of, practically a zombie, if you know what I mean. Do you know what I mean? It is not, it become a sort of horrifying thing in her own right somehow by keeping on going for so long. And I think there is this sense, what is it that's keeping her going? Is she consuming something? I mean, you mentioned with the Okumpa, I think there's a sense in that scene where Kes burns everything down. She sort of burns everything down, then she lies on the floor in this quite sort of ecstatic way. And then Tanis comes up and says, what's he say? Like, how was that for you? How did it feel? Or something. There is a kind of slight sort of sexual undertone to it. And certainly this sense, I think, although they don't really talk about it explicitly, that she seems to have sort of absorbed. I don't think it's just that she's kind of set things on fire and that's kind of exciting. It's almost like she's sucked some kind of energy out of it all in burning it. At least that's the kind of feeling that I get from it. So again, that sort of witchy idea of sort of absorbing someone's life force or someone's energy or whatever.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely an element of that, because I've got it up here where sort of like where sort of Susie's looking into like what do witches do, and it very much ties into sort of how it's presented, sort of that destructive kind of element where it's like she's like, what do witches do? And Dr. Frank Mundell goes, they're malefic, negative, and destructive. Their knowledge of the art of the occult gives them tremendous powers. They can change the course of events in people's lives through harm. You don't believe me? Their goal is to accumulate great personal wealth. It can only be achieved by injury to others. They can cause suffering, sickness, and even the death of those for whatever reason offend them. Why do you have all this interest in the occult? So yeah, very much that we sort of see Kess's powers continue to grow here, and very few of them are presented in positive ways, apart from being able to warm up a cup of tea. It's very much like we see, the infliction that it causes upon sort of Tanis, Tuvok, even sort of Tanis's powers as well. We sort of see him, launching Neelix across the room, etc. There's none of these powers we think, like they're going to be really nice or more advanced Bezeds. They come across as very dark and very powerful, and that's something we'll continue to kind of see as Kes evolves. When we see her leaving the ship in the Gift, she's basically detonating sort of corridors as she goes. The ship is destabilizing. When we see her come back in Fury, for example, she essentially gets Blanatoris killed. Goes back in time, her power corrupts her in a way. And I find that very interesting, sort of it doesn't shy away from sort of these powers, and their evolution is potentially very negative. And, we hear about sort of the Okompans being potentially kept down sort of in Caretaker, and these being sort of more powered, being given all these skills, that they've maybe potentially untapped something that sort of essentially comes when their lives get older. I find that really a very interesting decision, and very rare for Star Trek to explore that their main characters are actually potentially incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, it's true. We do certainly get a sense of that. I mean, yes, so she can basically microwave a cup of tea without involving the replicator. Should be said, Americans, as I understand it, don't have kettles, so that might be a more valuable skill than we would imagine. But when she tries to show it to Tuvok, there's that really quite horrifying scene. I mean, you know, up there with some of those early Voyager episodes, I think, you know, you think of something like Faces, they do have some real kind of gory, nasty horror moments. And this episode has a few of them. The most obvious probably is that scene where she basically boils Tuvok's blood by accident and his face is kind of, you know, kind of almost melting off of him somehow, and he's bleeding green blood everywhere, and it's kind of expanding. You know, he looks like his face is about to explode. Later on, she kind of similarly, she makes Tanis kind of cry bloody tears. You know, again, this sort of quite horrific horror imagery that we get there. I suppose the only positive thing is that the first time we get a sense of his powers, he does this trick where he sort of makes all her plants grow, and it seems quite benign and positive. Again, though, there's an interesting parallel with the movie Suspiria. It just occurs to me that the way in the kind of final section of that film, she kind of gets access to these to the sort of secret, there's a secret door basically that leads to where the witches are up to their witchy things, and she accesses it by turning a little image of a flower on the wall, if you know what I mean, because she realizes that this was a kind of clue that she picked up right at the beginning. So again, there's this kind of link of flowers somehow, something that seems quite benign. You know, these plants that she's growing seems very sort of earthy and innocent somehow. And he certainly uses that when he says, "Oh, this ship's so sterile." You know, he's kind of leaning into this idea that that she has this interest in this kind of organic element, and in this kind of something that's not kind of clean and crisp and Starfleet and replicated and so on, that she's kind of, you know, getting her hands in the soil or whatever, I suppose. But interesting that there's a kind of little parallel there with the kind of flowers, this sort of seemingly innocent flowers, then being linked to this quite sinister power. And definitely, you're right. By the time we see Kes coming back in Fury, she is a kind of, a kind of monster. She is basically a witch, I suppose, at that point, isn't she?
I think the one thing that you really highlight there as well is, like, this is a very bloody and horror imagery with a lot of blood, which is very rare but for Star Trek by this point. Because I was sitting there thinking, like, this is 1995. Only 4 years earlier, you have the Undiscovered Country, where they have to essentially give the Klingons pink blood, because the idea of sort of having these Klingons floating around and red blood all over the screen was, like, completely out of the question for Paramount. It was completely unthinkable. In this, you have horrific green blood, Tanis bleeding from the ears, etc. You know, you have a very similar image in Suspiria, where there's an individual hanging. Here you have Torres and another engineer hanging from the rooftops, essentially horizontal, dripping blood onto your lead character's kind of uniform. I was really surprised by that kind of culture change 4 years after sort of the Undiscovered Country, and how much of a sticking point that was. I mean, this episode, for example, was rated 12 on VHS when it kind of came out here in the UK, which it was becoming a bit more kind of common at the time, but, you know, it was still incredibly rare for that to kind of happen with Star Trek. I think it was the first one for Voyager anyway. And, you know, you think of Voyager as well, especially with someone like Brannon Braga. There is a lot of body horror and a lot of horror kind of episodes. You think of, like, Course Oblivion, Demon, Persistence of Vision, Coda, Scientific Method, Tuvok, The Thaw, Emanations, Faces, Threshold. Even sort of the Borg are body horror, and, you know, in terms of even the assimilation process, or even sort of 7 of 9 being kind of stripped down to a human and sort of the gift. It was really interesting to sort of examine Cold Fire as a potential pivot in terms of the use of blood, essentially, in Star Trek, where we take it for granted very much in sort of modern day New Trek in terms of how much blood and gore can be used in these episodes.
It's true. Whereas, you know, traditionally with Star Trek, if someone is mortally wounded, even, it's a phaser blast. It's very, you know, phasers are extremely clean. There's no gore. There's no kind of, none of the horror of it. You're right. I think that scene where Janeway comes in and the blood drips onto her shoulder, it is, you know, it's quite chilling in a way. And I think it's you know, it's a shocking moment, and she sells it as well. I mean, you talk about Kes, Kes does a impeccable kind of scream queen scream, in the earlier scene. She has quite a remarkable scream, actually, Jennifer Lean. Janeway doesn't quite go as far as screaming, but she has a look of kind of absolute horror as she kind of stares aghast at these, crew up in the ceiling. And I think there is something quite sinister about this idea. I mean, obviously there's something sinister about the idea of being levitated and being kind of lifted off your feet, which Suspiria then tries to do to Janeway as well. And she's kind of doubled over in pain at the time. But there is also something quite sinister about, I suppose, these things that are above you. I guess because as humans, we're sort of limited to the ground somehow. And in Suspiria, not only have you got that woman hanging near the beginning, at the end, hanging sort of at the end of a really horrific kind of violent assault in a sense, and then crashing down to the ground. But you've also got this really horrific scene where maggots start falling from the ceiling. And the girl Susie, first of all, she's got them in her hair. I think she's brushing her hair. And then suddenly there are like thousands and thousands of maggots crawling along the ceiling and just dropping on everyone. There's something quite horrifying, I think, about that sense of these things falling on you and being sort of, I don't know, that something threatening is above you. You certainly get that sense. You definitely get that sense with Janeway, kind of looking up in horror and seeing B'Elanna's there dripping blood on her. Much more so than if they were just, I don't know, on the other side of the room or in some other sort of impossible situation somehow. I think, I don't know quite what it is, but there is something quite shocking about it, I think.
It just feels ultimately as well like a very frustrating ending where it's never to be touched on again. Apparently the female caretaker, I don't remember this, was like, it never gets mentioned again until like an off the cuff remark sort of in the Voyager conspiracy. It feels like there's a complete kind of missed opportunity there where what did become of sort of Tanis and sort of the female caretaker, where did they sort of go? What was their journey? It could be a very interesting kind of double act pairing and so on. And, especially the fact that they live potentially in subspace, you can have them pop up anywhere, anytime. It's not like the Kazon where we essentially spend 2 years with them kind of trekking alongside them. You could have them pop up in season 7. You could have them pop up 20,000 light years away, wherever. You've got sort of, there could be a constant and interesting kind of villain. And I just want to know what happened with those 2,000 other sort of Ocampa. Did they vanish as well? Did they get a wish like Tanis? You think of sort of like a coven deprived of its leader is like a headless cobra, harmless, as they say in Suspiria. What did become of those 2,000 Ocampa that have developed these amazing skills, these powers? Were they sort of able to continue on? Was that the end of this expansion of their life? Who knows? I just felt that was a really a shame that was kind of left behind. I would love to know what became of them and how did they cope when, Suspiria left. Did she end up coming back? Who knows and stuff. I found it a frustrating ending, which I think can be the same said about a lot of Voyager episodes. Some really interesting concepts that could be played with so well, but they choose to kind of leave those toys on the shelf for sort of keeping it sort of episodic TV.
Yeah, I think it's true. It does feel like an episode that in some ways is kind of calling out for a sequel, and they've created a sort of interesting villain, even if they haven't totally explained it. I mean, it is a bit unclear. There's this suggestion that both Suspiria and the Ocampa believe that Janeway killed the caretaker rather than that he just died of old age. I do think it's quite unclear. What is her motive? Does she want the ship for some purpose? Does she want to absorb people? I mean, there's all this talk of going to her subspace realm and so on. It reminds me a little bit of the episode Coda, where there's that kind of creature that's sort of kind of like the devil and wants to absorb Janeway in his matrix. There's this kind of sense, are they trying to absorb, do they want to absorb Kes? Do they want to, I don't know, who knows what they're up to? Or is it just revenge that the caretaker, that Suspiria, as she says, blames Janeway for the death of her mate and wants to kind of have some kind of vengeance on her? But anyway, all of that could potentially be explored in future episodes, and it would be an interesting thing to come back to, but you're right, they don't. I don't know whether any of the novels or comics or anything have touched on this. I certainly don't remember seeing anything along those lines. And it's kind of tricky because the space station, obviously, they leave behind them straight away. But you're right, Suspiria herself, and in fact Tanis, because he sort of calls out to her, take me with you. And I think the idea is she's taken him into her subspace realm, isn't it? Rather than she's I don't think she's, beamed him back to the space station. So I don't know whether that's somewhere that he can come and go from easily, or what the kind of future holds there. But also they leave the door open, I suppose, because unlike Susie, who effectively burns the entire building, basically there's this kind of amazing scene when she kills the witch. All the other witches kind of start looking as if they're sort of suffocating. There's a kind of telekinetic crisis where furniture starts flying around the room, chandeliers exploding. Do you know what I mean? And the whole building is on fire by the end of it. Which again, you could say, I suppose, is maybe slightly referenced in the scene where Kes kind of burns down all the plants and so on. This idea of everything kind of conflagrating. Janeway doesn't go that route. Janeway is much more magnanimous. She decides to let Suspiria go and kind of, sort of turn the other cheek in a way. But it is interesting that insofar as Kes is the kind of scream queen in the story, she's this kind of virginal, innocent girl who, as you say, sort of realises what's going on and fights back. And it is true, she fights back against Tanis. But of course, it being Voyager, it's Janeway who has to come and deal with Suspiria with her kind of magic caretaker busting gun that she, fires at her. And then obviously she takes over. It's one of these stories where the captain sort of takes over at a certain point in order to do the Starfleet thing and kind of bring that stamp of moral authority in a way. But it does mean that the door is left open again, because they don't resolve this story kind of once and for all. And they even draw attention to that with Janeway saying, just as she says in Caretaker, we're going to be looking for this female entity. Here she's sort of saying, we're going to be looking for her again, and we'll see if we can have a better interaction next time. And I do think it's a shame in a way that they didn't, they could at least have sort of closed out a trilogy with a third episode that kind of definitively shut the book on this idea.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting as well, on a kind of final note from myself, Kes, for example, she does go through sort of the typical kind of horror kind of female lead. So many times the trope is that you look at the female character, whether she's a supporting character, like someone like Ellen Ripley in Alien, for example, or, sort of the other characters in a lot of horror films. She goes through that sort of journey where she is sort of presented as weak, someone that, it's Tuvok that's guiding her, it's Tanis that's guiding her, and ultimately at the end she puts them both in their place, intentionally or not, with sort of her powers. She reduces both of them to kind of their knees. And I think Jennifer Lane had a quote after where she was like, it presents Kes with a temptation and then leaves the decision up to the characters whether or not to give in. I feel that this is good because it displays another side of Kes, which is her confidence in being able to choose a path for her life. And I find that quite interesting. That is a journey that a lot of characters go through in horror. That we expect it to be the male characters that save the day, but ultimately it is the young woman, the virginal kind of character, the softly spoken blonde, they're the last one standing. Ultimately, it being Voyager and episodic TV, everyone's kind of standing at the end, but we certainly get a stronger kind of Kes for it, and one where we're kind of reminded, yes, these characters can be the teacher, whether they're Tuvok and Tanis, but ultimately this pupil will eventually outstrip out both of them by some distance and display some amount of power.
And it's quite striking. I mean, not everyone loves Kes as a character. I have a bit of a soft spot for Kes. We've sort of been fed this line for years that the Voyager writers didn't know what to do with Kes. They couldn't kind of crack her character. They weren't sure what to do with her. Now, in more recent times, it seems like some of the reasons surrounding Jennifer Lane leaving may not have been just about their kind of inability to work out how to write that character. There may have been, more going on there. But it just struck me watching this episode. This is what you do with Kes. This is, this is whatever you think of the episode. And it is a weird episode. It's a good episode for Kes. She puts in a great performance. It's a kind of interesting turning point for the character. It sort of definitely shows you the potential there to have a really interesting kind of ongoing storyline. I don't really feel they quite invested enough in it somehow. I mean, by the time she leaves in The Gift, yes, there's a kind of through line. I suppose it's a bit like a lot of Voyager continuity. There's a through line, but is it exactly an arc? Do you know what I mean? It doesn't feel... I don't really feel that the kind of Kes gaining her powers thing feels entirely satisfying, but it is at least it's something they can do with her character, and this I'd say is one of the episodes where it really works very well.
Yeah, I'm the same. Like, I think Kes, when she left, it didn't feel like a huge loss to the series. I mean, especially the fact that another really interesting kind of character came in that they were able to really run with. But it's episodes like this, you think there was something potentially really interesting there that they could have played with. And, you certainly saw that in 90s TV, especially things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, with your characters like your Willows, your Taras, your Supernaturals. I think that could have been something that could have been potentially really interesting to play with in Voyager, where you have a show that is about science. Those decisions. What happens when you have very much a spiritual character, a supernatural element in there as well? We saw that with Deep Space Nine. You could do sort of the spiritual characters and have that kind of conflict with, the Federation and science. I think there could have been something there, perhaps not as a kind of regular character, but I think as a sort of a potentially recurring thing. And again, as we saw, Kes with her supernatural abilities can drop in and out of the kind of show at will. And I think there could have been something much more interesting to do there than just the Fury episode, which I feel is a bit of a betrayal of the character.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes them a long time to bring her back for Fury, and they don't do a great job with it. It's interesting you point out the kind of science witchcraft contrast, and obviously we have Voyager headed by Janeway, who is the scientist, if you know what I mean. She's the kind of we know that her background is in science before she moved into command. There's an interesting decision in this episode, I think, that the kind of witchy magic is presented in quite scientific terms, insofar as when Kes is heating up the tea, we see it on a kind of molecular level, and the idea is she has to excite the atoms and so on. And it's kind of understood scientifically. And again, I guess when she's boiling Tuvok's blood, it's understood. It's not magic. It's kind of weird science, if you know what I mean. And so there's obviously a decision to try to represent what, you're right, is kind of almost coded as witchcraft in a kind of more traditional Star Trek-y scientific framework. And that would have been an interesting kind of thing to play with going forward, I suppose, as well. So again, as with a lot of Voyager, maybe something of a missed opportunity there. But either way, I think, I quite enjoy this episode. I enjoy it mainly because I think it's a bit of a weird one. I think it's a bit of a kind of, it's full, as you say, of odd choices. I think the movie Suspiria is quite a remarkable and very strange film. I mean, I'd recommend anyone go and definitely go and check it out. I am going to go and check out the remake, which seems pretty interesting from what I've seen so far. But yeah, I mean, it's one of these cases. It's not one of those ones where there's a very obvious sort of one-to-one parallel between the source material and the Star Trek adaptation. I don't think this is exactly an adaptation of the movie Suspiria, but the name is there, the hints are there, and they're definitely a kind of echoes of those original size, kind of coming through in the Star Trek storyline. Whether deliberately, consciously, or because Brannon Braga was so sort of suffused with the language of horror that some of that kind of just came through one way or another.
Yeah, I agree, and I highly recommend people do check out the original Suspiria, and the remake is incredibly interesting. I actually caught it at 8:30 in the morning on an IMAX screen in central London at a film festival, which was which is certainly a mood to watch a film like that that kind of way. And I think it's one of those ones. I think maybe some of the thoughts what we've thrown around today and so on, whether Brannon Braga or the people involved intended them, remains very much to be seen, but there's certainly something there. You don't have someone like Brannon Braga with what we know is his background and his interests, even if he's forgotten this episode altogether. There's certainly, he was certainly inspired by Suspiria in more than just the name, but I think there's definitely parallels visually, etc., that can be played with. I think ultimately my one disappointment with this episode is the direction. I just didn't feel matched the madness potentially of the script and so on. I found it quite bland direction from Cliff Bole, who is a pretty good director. I think they could have done a lot more sort of visually to make it sort of a bit more intense, etc. And, budget obviously held things back a little bit, but I think ultimately Coldfire, like, you know, stands out because it is an odd episode. It's something different. It's Voyager trying to do something bold and interesting, and it certainly stands out, you know, historically in terms of Trek about embracing that horror, whether it's kind of the blood element or whether it's the incredibly on the nose reference to something like Suspiria. I think it's a really interesting episode to go back and watch from start to finish, with, you know, that narration to the ending.
It's interesting when you talk about the direction. I mean, I would say Coldfire has some great moments. I'm not sure if it's ever really more than the sum of those parts, if you know what I mean. And I think you're right. There could have been more tying them together. It is tricky. I think Voyager is always trying to do gothic, trying to do horror, trying to do these things. And it is up against a challenge because it's such a bright, clean, you know, it's true what Tanis says, it is quite a sort of clinical environment. You know, everything is these kind of pale shades of grey and everything, and quite kind of clean and sterile looking. In some ways it's quite hard. It's not the Nostromo in Alien, which is grubby and dark and greasy and you know, somehow easier to imagine these kind of dark, sinister, creepy things going on. Obviously if you're watching these two things close together, you know, the movie Suspiria is very much a director's movie, if you know what I mean. I mean, the story, as I say, I'm not 100% sure if it even makes sense. It's quite opaque. It almost doesn't matter. It's one of those films as well, when I was watching it, the dialogue is very hard to make out at times. Even though apparently the entire film was pretty much dubbed afterwards. They didn't really use any of the original dialogue. But what you're struck by is this very intense vision of this kind of creepy, crazy, weird, monstrous situation, environment, and this real kind of directorial flair in the way that it's presented. You know, the camera moves, the use of colour in particular, and the use of sound as well. The Voyager episode, there is one moment where I think maybe it's when Tuvok's blood is boiling. It's in one of these kind of scary moments where the sound goes quite... It's not melodic, sort of Star Trek music, if you know what I mean. It starts gesturing slightly in that direction of scary, freaky kind of noises, but nothing to what you get in the, you know, 1977 movie with this prog rock band Goblin, who provides this just terrifying soundtrack. It's a bit like if you know like the music from The Exorcist or something like that. There's elements of that, only it's like turned up to 11 and very intense and very kind of in your face somehow. Obviously, Star Trek doesn't really do director's cinema in that way, but yeah, I suppose you're right. Maybe they could have done more. When I don't know if any of our listeners listen to Garrett Wong and Robert Duncan McNeil's podcast. I know you do, Lee. But when they were discussing The Delta Flyers is the name of the show. It's really good. I definitely recommend checking it out. When they were talking about this episode, Garrett Wong was saying he was a bit disappointed in the scene where the bodies are hung up in the sort of in the rafters in engineering. I think that scene is quite sort of shocking as it is. The fact that they're suspended up there and the fact that, you know, as we talked about, this blood is dripping down. But he was kind of saying he thought lying them flat like that slightly undermined the potential, the sort of horror potential of it, and maybe they should have been upside down, or they, you know, like in Suspiria, they should have been hanging as if they were hanged almost. That kind of laying them flat, maybe that was easier to film, but it takes some of the kind of shock value out of that. So, you know, that from him was a criticism of the director, basically saying you haven't quite leaned into the nastiness of this as much as you could have done it. And maybe that's true. You know, maybe Cliff Bole directed it in a fairly sort of safe Star Trek-y way. Maybe these days, you know, with shows like Discovery, the directors have a little bit more freedom. I mean, if you think of that Klingon episode they did in Discovery Season 2, where it kind of went down a real sort of Game of Thrones path for a while, there's maybe a bit more freedom to slightly go off the wall a bit now and then.
Yeah, and I think that was the ultimate reality. Is like you have someone like, especially Brannon Braga. I always interpret him as very much a very visual kind of writer as well. And I think ultimately he probably had this kind of script, but ultimately just hits the kind of reality of a Star Trek family show, you know, UPN Fridays, 9 p.m. You know, what they probably got away with was probably as on the edge as they could possibly do. So I think there's definitely restrictions there. But yeah, I just would have liked to have just seen a bit more of a visual flair, but ultimately that's something that I apply to a lot of 90s Star Trek. So I feel a bit unfair on pulling Cliff Bole out for this one.
Well, Lee, it's been a pleasure having you back on the show, and thank you for getting me to watch this quite extraordinary movie, which I might not otherwise have done. If our listeners want to track you down on social media and argue with you about the relative merits of these two versions of this movie, not to mention the Star Trek episode, let them know where they can find you, and also give us an idea of what else you've been working on recently.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Lee Hutchison _ or at Star Trek VHS. And you can find me on my own podcasts, Filibuster, which is sort of a general film culture show, and the A24 Project, which looks at the films released by the American independent distribution company A24. So something very different from Star Trek, but every so often the two worlds cross over. So we've discussed recently Green Room, which has Patrick Stewart as a Nazi coming up against a musician in the form of Anton Yelchin. So there's always a little bit of Star Trek never too far away. Fantastic.
Well, thanks as ever for coming back on the show. We'll make sure to get you back again sometime soon as well.
I look forward to it.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended all right.